All right, today we're going to be talking about the parts of the digestive system. Your goal for this is to be able to label the different parts of the digestive system, but also then to be able to tell me what those parts do, how they help us digest our food so that we can get the nutrients to all of our cells. Here's how this is going to work. We have a diagram in the notes packet. If you don't have that notes packet or you don't have that diagram, you can get it from me when you return. But you can still write down the definitions of these different parts. You'll just be doing the labeling later. So on your diagram, what I would like you to do, find this one, okay? In class, we'll be coloring them. You don't need to color them. You can just skip past this. And think about, what do you think this organ is? If you said the salivary glands, you would be correct. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about is the salivary glands. We did an activity looking at what gets digested in the mouth. And the salivary glands are in the mouth. There's a bunch of different ones. And as you can see, we get glucose and other complex carbohydrates changing. So why do complex carbohydrates decrease and glucose increase? Well, because the complex carbohydrates are going to be broken down. They're being broken down, so that's why they're decreasing. When they get broken down, the building blocks are glucose. So glucose is going to increase. So we know that carbs get digested in the mouth. So what helps us digest those carbs? Well, our salivary glands have an enzyme called amylase that digests those carbohydrates. We learned about enzymes way back in the DNA unit. Polymerase, helicase, they help build up or break down molecules. With these enzymes we're learning about in the digestive system, they're going to help break down molecules. So amylase digests carbohydrates, breaks them down. We also need salivary glands to secrete mucus, and mucus helps make our food wet so it doesn't scratch when it goes down our throat. So pause here if you need to continue writing. Next up, we've got this guy. What do you think this is? This is the tongue. Yeah, so the tongue here, why do you think we need a tongue? We know it helps us talk, helps us taste, but how does it help our food? Your tongue actually keeps the food between your teeth. It moves food around. So it can keep it within your teeth. It can help push it to the back of your throat. So when you swallow, so the tongue is there to help kind of move the food around. Next up, we have this guy who is not actually part of the digestive system. It's part of the respiratory system. If you notice, it goes to these two organs, which are the lungs. So this is the trachea. Your trachea is a windpipe, so that's just another word, but it's the tube to your lungs, essentially. You'll notice, I'm going to talk about this diagram over here, that there is two tubes, one where food goes down, and then one that's going to go to your lungs. So we want to make sure the food is going down the correct tube, the correct path. And you'll notice there's a little flap there that pushes closed to block off the trachea so that food doesn't go into our lungs. So we'll talk more about that little flap, the epiglottis, in a different unit. But the food goes down and it goes into the next part, which is our stomach. Before we get there, we got to talk about what that tube is called. So notice again, two tubes here. One's going to the lungs. This one, though, is leading to the stomach. This is our esophagus, and it is where our food travels. So if we take a look at what gets digested in the esophagus, you'll notice nothing changes here. Nothing gets digested in the esophagus. It's just a transporting tube to get us from the mouth to the stomach. And so that's what we're going to write for letter D. Letter D on your diagram is the esophagus, so the tube to the stomach. Speaking of the stomach, this is the stomach here. So for the stomach, let's take a look at what happens in the stomach. What do we get changing here? You'll notice we get a little bit of protein being digested, fats, and carbs. So this is where stuff starts getting digested. The stomach helps digest stuff because it actually helps mix and churn the food. You can see a picture over here of that stomach kind of squeezing. The stomach's a muscle. We have muscles all along our digestive system, and the stomach is squeezing to mix the food. We also know the stomach has acid. If you've ever had food go the wrong way, if you've thrown up, you know that sometimes it can burn your throat. That's because there's really strong acids that help break down some of the molecules there. We saw that proteins and fats start getting digested here. And in order to do that, we need some enzymes. So we're going to talk about one specific enzyme here. There's lots of enzymes in our digestive system, and we don't have time to talk about them all. But pepsin is an enzyme to digest protein. Easy way to remember that is protein and pepsin both start with the letter P. Now, this is going to be one of those enzymes that we're learning about. It doesn't end in ACE. Most enzymes are going to end in ASE. This one does not. An interesting thing about the stomach is the stomach has kind of like doors that open and close on the top and bottom. We have a name for these. They're called sphincters, and they're rings of muscles, a ring of muscles, and they control an opening. We have them lots of places in our body, but they basically can squeeze tight shut to prevent stuff from going past, or they can relax and open to allow stuff going through. So on your diagram, I want you to make sure you draw in these three sphincters. They're important because as the stomach is churning and mixing, we don't want food to go on too early, and we don't want food to go back up the wrong way. After the stomach's mixed, churned, added acid, it moves on to the next part. And this is the first part of the small intestine. And it has a fancy name. It's called the duodenum, duodenum, duodenum. There's lots of pronunciations for this. So in our duodenum, we have beginning and the middle of our small intestine and then large intestine. Notice, take a look at all of my columns here. A whole bunch of them are moving. Proteins, fats, carbs. Again, proteins, fats, carbs. By the time it gets to the large intestine, what happens? There's not a lot left. Well, where did they go? They had to get absorbed. So that's what we're going to look at next. Where do all these things get absorbed? Because they have to get to all of our cells in our body. We're going to learn that in order to do that, they have to get into our bloodstream. But first, let's talk about what happens in the beginning part of the small intestine. The beginning part is called the duodenum. It is our first part of our small intestine. This is where most digestion happens. And again, we're digesting everything. Just like in the stomach, we're digesting everything here. Proteins, fats, carbohydrates. After the duodenum, after the first section, then we go on to the rest of the small intestine. Technically, the rest of the small intestine has other fancy names. There's a name for the middle part. There's a name for the ending part. We're not going to learn those names. If you take an anatomy class, you might learn those. In general, in the small intestine, this is where our food is going to get absorbed. So it's going to go from the intestines into our bloodstream. And you might wonder, well, how does it do that? Well, I'm going to show you a picture of what the small intestine looks like on the inside. So on the inside of the small intestine, if we zoom in, remember, the small intestine is about 1 inch round. So it's not very wide. So they have all these microscopic little fingery things. It might look like a sea anemone or a car wash or a mop you have at home. The reason we have this is it helps increase our surface area. If you're a molecule and you can go into any part of one of these little projections, it's going to be a lot easier than if this were just flat. Because if it's flat, it's a lot smaller of a space for you to try to get into. So these guys have a name. They're finger-like projections. So these little fingers, they can contain blood vessels. This is where our nutrients get absorbed. So because they have blood vessels, the nutrients can diffuse in here, go in our bloodstream in those little capillaries and get delivered to all of our cells so that our cells have nutrients. After the small intestine, before we get to the large intestine, we have this little dead end organ. So this guy here is the appendix. You can get it removed. It doesn't have a super well-known function. They think it might hold bacteria that might be helpful, but you don't need it. And so if it gets inflamed and you get appendicitis, you can get it removed. Scientists believe that this is a vestigial organ. We talked about this in evolution, right? An organ that doesn't really have a known function and is left over from evolution. Other animals have a larger appendix, and it's useful. It helps them digest grass and other foods. So you'll notice food doesn't really go here. It goes from the small intestine into the large intestine. Sometimes if it gets stuck in here, that can lead to appendicitis where it's inflamed. All right, and then we've got our large intestine. Our large intestine's named large because it's larger in width. It's wider. It's not longer, it's only 5 feet, and the small intestine's about 20-something feet. If we take a look, we've digested most of our stuff already. It's been absorbed, that's why it's at 0. So what's left then? Well, water. Water's changing. So it's all the waste, and now we're just going to squeeze the water out. So the large intestine helps us reabsorb the water so that when our waste comes out, it's solid rather than watery. If this isn't working right, then you get diarrhea. Before our waste is eliminated, it gets stored here. This is our rectum. It's just a little spot to store the waste, okay? So it gets stored here, stores solid waste. And our opening, again, this is an opening, we said has a ring of muscles. And that ring of muscles is called the anus. It actually has, it has a sphincter on it that controls when that opens and closes. So the anus is where the solid waste leaves the body, and it's controlled by a sphincter muscle.